This is one of those stories that makes you pinch yourself afterward and think, I was so close to being dead wrong about how safe the world is. I moved out of the city because I wanted quiet. I wanted trees and a real sky and trails that didn't smell like exhaust. I wanted a place where my biggest worry would be whether my dog would roll in something gross. I didn't expect any of those ordinary comforts to become the setting for 3 of the most chilling, inexplicable nights of my life. I keep a handful of short videos on my phone, little stupid vlogs of walks and sunsets that remind me I existed on some ordinary calm day. It was one of those 20-second clips that changed everything. The trail I took most weekends cut through a strip of state land people barely used. It wasn't a well-groomed park. It was a muddy single track that opened into a swampy clearing where cattails bowed like grey ghosts. The air there was always a hair thicker, like wet wool. On clear days, the tree line looked like a black silhouette, and in the late afternoon the sun hit the water and everything looked kind of false, too shiny, like a set. That Sunday I walked for an hour and a half. My jacket was damp from the fog and my breath came out in clouds I could see. I set my phone on a rock and hit record because I liked having evidence that I wasn't losing my mind. Camera gives memory a backbone. I talked to it like an idiot, about the light, about how lucky I felt. The video was 20-some seconds. Me, the shallow water, the far bank with its jagged trees. I remember laughing at some private thought and then walking toward the trail, planning to take the loop back. I didn't think the clip would matter. I made a detour to the restroom at the small park near the trailhead. There was a woman folding laundry in the back of a van, strange but not criminal, and 2 kids kicking an empty bottle down the path. I remember the sticky heat of the plastic of the restroom door under my palm and the echo of a dog barking far off. Then he was there. He approached like anyone approaches when they think they're being casual. Black hoodie, sunglasses even though it was waning light, a purple knit cap pulled over the hoodie, and a face that didn't look like it belonged with the rest of the park. 2 blank, 2 small smiles at the wrong times. He asked for a cigarette in a way that felt like a test, like he was practicing conversation in case someone bought it. I told him I didn't smoke. He laughed. He said, "Hey there," like we were old friends. Something in me sharpened. I didn't want to be rude. I didn't want to make a scene. He stayed. He told me he was from around here, which was useless because this area pulls in transient people and folks who'd lived here forever. The word means nothing. He wanted to know if I came alone. He wanted to pop my hood just to see where you're from, he said. That line was the first time I actually felt my chest tighten into a fist. I tried to be breezy. I should have walked away, but I didn't. Maybe I thought maybe he was harmless. Maybe I didn't want to be paranoid. Maybe I was just tired. Instead, I took 2 steps back toward the parking lot, and he matched me. He laughed again and said it was no big deal. Then a couple arrived on a dog walk. They looked normal, sweaters pulled up against the chill, and they had the kind of calm that seemed to come from being unconcerned on purpose. When he started to get closer, I stepped in front of them, sort of between me and the man, and the couple moved with me, like instinct. The woman stood next to me and said something like, "You okay?" in a tone that made him shift. He tried to charm his way out, just making conversation, but the way his fingers flexed at his sides didn't read like casual. The man in the purple hat said, "No, no, no," as if he were backing down from something invisible. I don't remember him saying anything violent. He didn't have to. The tension was an animal that sat between us and breathed. The couple stayed until he walked away into the trees, and only when I was sure he wasn't circling back did I let myself breathe. They offered to walk me to my car. I accepted, probably too eagerly. I should have filed that as a close call and moved on. I didn't. I went home and downloaded that 20-second clip from the trail because I like to be able to look at things later and say, "See, nothing happened." I watched it once, twice, and then, on a stupid whim, I froze the frame where the trees blur into each other. That's when I saw him. There he was in the tree line, half hidden by branches. Same purple hat, same black hoodie. He wasn't close to me in the frame. He was distant and small, back at the edge where the path narrows and the brush thickens. He wasn't standing there when I was recording the 2 seconds I remembered. He wasn't in the clearing. He was tucked into the boundary, where the light hunched into shadow. It changed the geometry of the whole day. The man who'd stopped me at the restroom had not wandered up to the bathroom by chance. He'd been trailing me. He had been in the tree line while I thought I was alone. He had been closer to me earlier than I could remember. That small, indistinct figure in the video made the hair on my arms lift. I called the police. I told the dispatcher what I had. The time, the trail, my suspicion. They asked for details and took my statement. I showed them the clip. They said they would look. They asked if I could think of anyone who might have been upset with me. I told them no. I had no enemies, only the stupid little gripes of daily annoyance. They took the video onto their system and said they would check the area, ask park rangers to do sweeps, and look for persons fitting the description. I waited the rest of the night like a kid waiting for a package, checking the door every time the gravel under the street lamp shifted. The police came by later that week and said they'd run the area several times but hadn't found him. He could be anyone, one of them said. Could be transient, could be local. We'll keep an eye. That was honest language, but not comforting. There are 2 truths that settled in me like dust. 1, technology can prove that someone was closer than you thought. 2, proof doesn't guarantee prevention. A year later, I left. Not that week or even that month, but the unease compounded. You learn to measure changes in yourself by the habits you stop doing. I stopped taking that trail alone. I stopped leaving my phone on a rock to record light. I stopped trusting that a passerby or a park volunteer would always be there. The couple who had walked me to my car became a kind of beating heart in my memory. They had no idea how important an ordinary gesture was. Their presence, for a few minutes, probably turned a possibility into a non-event. I never saw them again to thank them properly. That 20-second clip sits on a hard drive somewhere. The figure in the tree line is pixelated, small. It could be a trick of light. It could be a hat someone threw down. It could be a person who had nothing ill in mind. I don't know. I don't know what his intent was. I only know that the same ordinary path that had soothed me for months became the place I learned how close can be. If you love real-life scary stories, hit subscribe and stick around. I've got 2 more you'll want to hear. I thought that was the worst of it. In my head, I put the Purple Hat Man on a shelf labeled "Bad Luck, No Follow-Through." That confidence lasted about a week. Ron called me on a Tuesday at work, voice wobbling like a badly tuned radio. "You remember the house we looked at? The one with the thing that happened there?" he said without finishing. He and Tina had closed on it 6 months earlier. When they signed the papers, the seller had told them quietly that someone had died in the house years before. Real estate agents have ways of softening words. Sometimes someone died becomes a shrug. They had joked nervously at first. They'd moved in, painted the rooms, brought boxes of half-broken plates and cheap furniture. For a while, it had been a normal kind of other couples' chaos. Then things went missing. Small stuff at first. A coffee mug from the windowsill, a spoon. Then the noises started. "It's probably mice," Tina said to the small group of us when we visited the first time, half joking, half hopeful. Mice are a tidy narrative. They have teeth and motivation. A human living in your walls is a different plot. Ron's laugh stopped sounding like a laugh. When he told me he heard footsteps at night and doors he knew he'd locked were ajar in the morning, he sounded exhausted in a way that made a sympathetic knot form in my chest. I didn't drive out with a flashlight and a badge. I went because Ron is my friend, and because the house had always had a weird gravity for me. There's a way some houses feel like they carry stories. This one had scraped history on its paint. A sad set of curtains, a backyard with a lone swing that didn't move, a kitchen with the faint, greasy shadow of meals cooked and not cleaned. The cellars had not hidden the previous death. They'd mentioned it like a minor detail, but they hadn't said anything about missing items or noises. It's one thing to buy a place with a history. It's another to find out history is ongoing. That afternoon, Tina mentioned a mug. It was Ron's favorite, she said, and I saw panic cross her face. In the half-second her voice left the room. It was a cheap Miami Dolphins mug with a chip at the rim. She'd left it on the counter next to the sink, and then later it was gone. The mug had a small personal history. Some nights they'd sip crappy instant coffee while arguing about the placement of a couch. To them, it was a household artifact, domestic and mundane. When it's missing, your house starts to feel porous. You ask, who moves around in my life like they belong? They reported it to the police. They put a note on their calendar to check their door locks. They bought a motion-activated light for the back porch. But notes and lights don't answer the deeper question. What are we missing when we're not in the room? What footprints are invisible until we step in them later? Ron called me again the night he couldn't go to the basement. He'd heard something heavy, like someone rearranging boxes. He said the stairs creaked under weight that wasn't his. I remember him sounding almost ashamed of his own fear, as if there were a threshold where a man must be brave or be judged. I can't go down, he said. I can't. I told him I'd come over. I grabbed a flashlight and my phone, because my phone is how I prove things to myself. The drive out there is mostly country lanes where trees press in and the radio cuts in and out. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the house looked like any other suburban place at dusk. Mailbox, neat shrubs, a porch. It was easy to forget the oddities until I walked up the stairs and felt the cold that houses hold in winter. This kind of cold, like closed books. Ron opened the door and looked at me like someone who'd been holding a breath for too long. Tina had moved boxes into the garage to declutter, her hands shaking as she carried a lamp. She made coffee and didn't drink it. She kept glancing at corners, like she expected someone to slide out from behind them and say hello. We made a plan that was both simple and absurd. I would go down to the basement, camera rolling, and prove to Ron that nothing was there. I told myself I'd be dramatic about it, light-hearted, a little sarcastic. It's easier to confront fear when you can pretend you're not afraid. So I took my phone, hit record, and told Ron to follow behind and keep the top of the stairwell lit. I did the whole thing like a YouTube video. All right, folks, let's check the basement. Please go easy on me. It's humiliating to admit how much I'm a sucker for dumb bravado. The basement door was cold under my fingers. I could hear the house settle, pipes humming like distant insects. The light hit in pools. Old shelving cast long fingers across the concrete. There was that smell, the sour, stale odor of a room that's been shut away, old blankets, the tang of mildew, the kind of domestic stink that means someone slept there sometimes and never drew a breath into the air long enough to change it. I kept the camera steady. My voice sounded small and practiced, the kind of whisper you use in a horror movie when you want to be credible. Okay. Just checking the boiler, the fuse box. I narrated like it was absurd, but necessary. I walked past boxes stacked to the ceiling, Christmas decorations, a crate of outdated books, a child's soccer ball. The light caught on plastic eyes of toys, making them glint like accused witnesses. Then the beam hit a corner, and I froze. At first it registered as a shape, an outline against the grey cinder block. Then the camera adjusted, and I saw the man. He didn't look like anything out of a movie. He was small and thin, a face that had lost muscle somewhere along the way, so that the skin lay a little too loose like fabric on a mannequin that's been sun-bleached. He sat with a blanket bunched around his knees and a pillow propped against the wall. There was a chipped mug next to him. It was Ron's mug. The same Miami Dolphins logo, the same missing chip. He looked up at the light as if at something he'd been expecting for an age. His eyes were the color of an old film, faint and reflective. He made a noise. It wasn't a full sound, more like a groan or a small animal startled. I remember the way he reached for the door handle, like a man who hadn't seen an open door in years. That movement was the most human, terrible thing. I stepped forward and grabbed the door as it tried to swing inward. For a second, the world narrowed. Me, the camera, the man, the flimsy door. He began to thrash. Not violently in a way that was gore-filled or cinematic, but frantic, hands clawing, mouth moving like someone who had rehearsed the word please without landing on it. He made a sound like no, 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 which is pathetic when you think about it, because it's a child's first protest and a startled animal's cry. "Hey!" I shouted. The camera was still rolling. I think Ron was above me somewhere, at the top of the stairs, with the light like a halo. Tina was behind him, her face a mixture of horror and a maternal kind of fear, like seeing a child where a threat should be makes the world tilt. He tried the door again, harder this time. I slammed my shoulder into it, held on, felt the wood strain in my palms. It felt like holding the last thing between a person and something unknown. He looked at me through the crack, and his pupils were big like moons. I shouted for Ron to call the police. My voice broke in a way I hadn't expected. For a second, everything was animal and raw. His need, our fear, the absurd intimacy of two lives colliding down a flight of concrete stairs. I remember thinking, irrationally, about the mug. How heavy it must have seemed to someone who decided to sleep in a basement, how domestic objects anchor a person to a place. When he screamed, I grabbed the door and pressed my whole body against it. The scream wasn't loud for long, but it vibrated the air and left a ringing silence when it stopped. I could hear sirens somewhere far off, or maybe that was only in my chest. The scene had the slick, overheated quality of a dream you wake from and don't fully remember, familiar and awful at the same time. I don't know what he intended. I don't know whether he slipped in years before and made the basement his shelter, or whether he slipped in weeks before because something else had broken for him on the street. I know what I saw. The blanket, the pillow, the mug. I know what I felt, the panic that you make decisions in when adrenaline sharpens everything and you are asked to choose nothing but the present moment. "Keep the door closed," I said, and my voice was quieter. "Don't open it, don't—" I couldn't finish because my throat had gone sandpaper. Over the camera's lens, the man's face was a study in desperation. He banged the door with shaking hands. I could hear his breathing like someone trying not to drown. The phone kept recording. We kept the door closed. The house smelled like burnt coffee and dust. The moment stretched until the sound of something, maybe tires, maybe the distant shift of a neighborhood dog, cut through. I could have told the whole rest of the story right then. The police arriving, the frantic explanation, the old man slipping away into the slatted world of the night. I could have told you how the mug sat on the concrete like a small, polite evidence of intrusion. I could tell you every step that followed, but that is not what I will tell you next. Because for a beat that lasted forever, I realized how unmoored we all are from the stories we inherit from houses. There was the revealed fact. Someone had been living in their basement. And then there was the shapeless, terrible question of why. His clothing wasn't ragged in a way that told a clear story. It was layered and worn. He smelled of old fabric and something metallic, like the residue of a life outdoors or in basements and hallways and the spaces people avoid looking into. His eyes were not angry so much as hollowed. They held the look of someone who had trained himself not to ask for help because asking didn't stick. I told myself to record for evidence. I told myself to stay calm for Ron and Tina. I told myself not to be a hero. The phone filmed a small, real thing, a man who had been living in a basement. The footage is the kind of proof that makes you glad in a dispassionate way that cameras exist. "Don't let him out," Tina whispered from the stairs. Her voice was worse than the banging. Fear is one thing, helplessness is worse. It squeezes you into a small, ugly shape. I braced myself and held the door. He kept trying. He kept saying no, 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 like the mantra of someone who had only that word left that meant something to them. And then, before the sound of sirens that would later come, before the moment the rest of the world bent around our small private disaster, there was a pause. A silence so thick it felt like night had fallen into the house. I realized in that moment how strange and terrible it is to be the person who sees the evidence, to be the one who looks into a corner and finds a life that doesn't belong, to be the person who knows what "someone died here" means in practical terms. Things remain, people move on, and sometimes others take the spaces left behind. My hands were shaking, the camera kept rolling. The man in the basement made no further sound. The light from the stairwell painted a hard rectangle on the concrete. Outside the house, the world rolled on. Mailboxes waited for mail. Streetlights made halos in damp evening air. Inside there was a man with a pillow and a favorite mug. I should have stopped the recording. I didn't. I think I wanted the proof for when the story bent in ways I didn't expect. I think I wanted to show and say, we saw him. He was real. Ron and Tina pressed their faces to the stairwell opening, and in their eyes I saw a mix of horror and compassion that I have never quite processed. There are people who will call you to action, and people who will stand and do nothing. That night they did the right thing. They called the police. The last thing I remember before everything sped up was the man's hand on the concrete, reaching. It was not a final movement. It was a reach toward the only thing that looked like home. I kept my shoulder against that door until the sound of a distant engine became the sound of a car in their driveway. I heard footsteps on the gravel. I heard a voice that sounded like orders. I felt the house reconfigure itself around new actors. Uniforms, clipboards, questions that start with, when did you first, and did you notice? The world assembled itself like a play with a director who wanted facts, chronology, names. But I won't tell you how the police responded tonight, not yet. I'll tell you this, the discovery in the basement was not tidy. It did not fit into a single box you can label solved. It left more questions than answers. And it left Ron with the sense that his home had been violated in a way that can't be fixed by changing locks or by putting his favorite mug away in a cupboard. We stood there with our ordinary lives abruptly complicated. The house had been the stage for something that wasn't about ghosts or metaphors. It was about someone else taking up physical space in their life. The presence of that man, the fact of him, the sight of his blanket, his pillow and the mug was evidence in the most brutal sense. Someone had been there, sleeping, living, surviving in a place they were not supposed to inhabit. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know how long he'd been there. I don't know whether he was running from something or towards something, or whether he simply had nowhere else to go. Those are questions for the police and for the long, tedious work of paperwork and backstory that I am not qualified to answer. What I do know is the feeling of holding the door, the sound of a human beating against a barrier like an animal at a fence. It's the sort of thing that burrows into you and refuses to leave. It changes the way you look at open spaces and closed doors. It rewires the idea of safety. We waited on the stairs. We held the door. We watched the camera record. I felt small and ridiculous and important all at once. There is something about being an ordinary person that makes seeing extraordinary things feel illegible, a glitch you do not understand how to explain. It was in that suspended state, with the man pressing against the other side and our breath sour in the air, that my phone buzzed with a text from someone I hadn't expected to hear from. But that's a story for later. And it opened a new thread that would tangle with everything I thought I knew about help and about who you can rely on when the world feels like it's collapsing. The footsteps on gravel grew louder. The light at the top of the stairs cut a harder edge against the floor. My finger was cold on the phone screen. The camera was still recording. The man kept saying something I couldn't quite catch. words that sounded like apologies and complaints combined. Then a shadow passed in the doorway above, and I realized I wasn't the only one who'd come with plans. I realized other people were starting to arrive who would change the immediate calculus of what we could do. I braced, still holding the door, and waited for what would come next. The footsteps on the gravel grew louder, and then a flashlight carved a line through the doorway above. A uniformed officer's voice cut into the air, sharp and practical. "Police! Step away from the door!" And for a second I thought maybe the whole thing would end like one of those TV shows where everyone breathes out and everything goes normal. It didn't. By the time the officers unlatched the front door and swept in with radios crackling, the sound from the basement had dropped like a record skipping. The banging stopped. The breathy animal panic that had been demanding space in our house softened into a tight, bad quiet. Someone radioed up the stairs. They wanted to know if anyone was hurt. There was a flurry of questions. Who was home? Where had we seen him? What was his description? I answered with the kind of clipped clarity that comes from shock. Facts like pebbles. Small, thin blanket mug, bathroom door held closed. They went to the basement with the sort of methodical calm people develop when they've practiced being unflappable. I heard them say things I didn't fully register. Evidence, search, perimeter. They photographed the floor. They asked Ron and Tina to give statements again. A neighbor's flashlight painted the walls in frantic arcs. Someone bagged the mug as evidence. They spoke about entry points, places to look. None of it felt clean. None of it wrapped the night in a neat conclusion. The man was gone. They searched the yard and the underbrush until their flashlights began to look like fruitless lures. They checked crawl spaces and drainage pipes. They canvassed the street. The one officer who seemed to have the most time on detail crouched and scanned the concrete where the mug had been, then looked up at us and said quietly, "Sometimes they move on before we get there." It was not accusatory. It was a statement of limits. What I remember most after they left was the small domestic details that felt obscene in their ordinariness. The mug on a metal table in an evidence bag, the blanket left folded where the man had used it, the faint, damp imprint on a pillow that didn't belong to the house. Tina wrapped her arms around herself like a person trying to gather up scattered courage. Ron sat on the top step and didn't move for a long time. The officers left with a promise to follow up, to look at camera footage if we had it, to talk to neighbors. They put on paper the names of people they had spoken to and gave us reference numbers that sounded like the world's least comforting talismans. The days afterward were a study in small, repetitive acts meant to stitch up something that had been torn. Ron changed the locks. He installed a keypad deadbolt and motion lights in the backyard. Tina insisted on curtains double-tucked and put a chain on the basement door. They told me they slept poorly for months, waking at the sound of the furnace or a distant car and checking the house with the animal reflex of someone who has been startled too many times. A month later, there was a call from the detective assigned to the case. They had followed a few leads. They had a vague description out: age range, clothing, a possible transient with a thin frame. They'd checked shelters and local hospitals. There were rumors of someone matching that description being seen near an underpass a few miles away. Nothing definitive. No arrest. The detective's voice was professional and tired. "We look at everything," she said. "We can't say he won't surface again, but we did what we could with what we had." That phrase, "what we had," is a rationing of hope. Ron and Tina's house stayed a home, but it had a new rhythm to it. The habit of checking locks became ritual. The basement door gained a double check at sundown. I noticed small changes in them that I still think about. Tina stopped leaving her phone on the countertop. She carried it in her pocket like a talisman. Ron's laugh came back in patches, but he didn't linger in the kitchen at night the way he used to. They began to treat their own space as something to guard, and in that guarding there was a grief I couldn't fix. For me, the image of the man with the mug stayed lodged like a visual hiccup. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night and for half a second be in the basement again. Cold concrete, the light's edge, the way his hand reached for the handle. It made me more watchful, at times overly so. I found myself checking gaps under hedges, peering into the shadowed corners of porches. The camera on my phone became less an archive of ordinary days and more a necessary witness. If you think that was the worst of it, I understand why you'd believe that. I did for a while, but fear isn't linear. It doesn't climb and stop. It spreads, buds, and returns in new shapes. A few months after the basement incident, on a late spring evening when the air had that wrong mix of warmth and damp, I took a job dog-sitting for my old boss. He had a big house on a quiet street with a long driveway and a manicured lawn, and he traveled a lot. The work was easy money and a welcome break from the pall of Ron and Tina's house. I'd done it before without incident. That was part of why the following nights felt so wrong. They'd started from the place where my familiarity should have been armor. Max is a golden-colored mutt with a soundless trot and the kind of unconcerned personality that makes you feel like everything will be all right. He slept at the foot of the bed, snoring like a contented vacuum. The first night I was there, I couldn't sleep. New houses have a vocabulary of sounds I'm always learning to translate. A refrigerator's whisper, the plumbing's coughs, the house settling into being. I told myself that laying there awake was normal. Too much coffee, old nerves, but the unease had nothing to do with caffeine. At about 1 a.m, I took Max for a walk down the driveway just to breathe. The streetlights cast halos that made everything look a little soft around the edges. From the corner of my eye, I thought I saw someone standing by the opposite curb under a streetlight. I squinted into the dark and told myself it was a neighbor walking their dog, or someone waiting for a ride. But there was a strange stillness about them. They didn't cross the street. They didn't walk. They stayed under the halo of the lamp, a silhouette as steady as a statue. I shrugged and chalked it up to my sleepless brain and the way a tired eye invents shapes. I took Max around the block and noticed nothing else. When we came back, the figure had shifted a few feet. It was the kind of movement that feels like a recalculation, like someone rechecking an address. I told myself it must be teenagers messing around. There's always a cheap, consoling explanation when the mind wants to keep faith with ordinary goodness. But then it happened again, another night, another hour, and this time I snapped a quick video on my phone. The person stood under the same streetlight, hands in pockets, head down. In the clip, you can see the halo of light and a thin figure between cars. A few minutes later, I watched the clip back, heart beating a pattern I didn't like, and realized that in the reflection of a window across the street, there was another figure further down, pacing. I felt the old, familiar animal tightening in my chest. I tried to be rational. I told myself people loiter, people smoke at odd hours, people are bored. I told myself I was making a mountain out of a molehill. I put the footage on my phone and fell asleep, telling myself nothing would come of it. On the third night, at the same hour, I found myself outside again with Max, phone in hand. I told myself I was gathering evidence, the sort of thing you do now if you hope someone will believe you later. The person under the streetlight had a hoodie up and the silhouette of a baseball cap under the hood. They stood with their back to me, like someone who wanted to be seen, but only on their terms. I raised the phone and pressed record. They saw me record. The figure turned toward me with a speed that made my stomach drop, not the slow, casual look of a passerby to whom your presence means nothing. The head turned like a radar, locking on. For 2 heartbeats, they stood as if considering whether to cross the space between us. Then, without a sound, they moved, they charged. There is a wordless terror in being charged by an unseen stranger in the dark. Max lunged forward, heavy and immune to the finer points of politeness. I ran. The rest is compressed into the kind of memory that plays in short, bright loops. My shoes slipping on wet grass, the length of the porch seeming to stretch, the key in my hand that finally found the lock. I remember the metallic click like a small salvation. I remember slamming the door behind me and having to look through the peephole to see if someone was outside the glass. Then the doorbell rang. I froze with keys still in my hand. Whoever was outside didn't shout or pound. They didn't demand anything. They pressed the doorbell and waited. I watched through the peephole. A shadow stood near the path, then moved closer to the porch. A face was indistinct in the ring of light. A voice, low, casual, said, "Have a good night," and turned to walk away. They didn't stay to talk. They didn't announce any intent. They tried the knob. It shook, then stayed closed. They left with that soft, almost bored, "Have a good night," like a person who had just checked a box. The whole thing felt obscene, the calmness after aggression, the ordinary line used as a smokescreen for something that wasn't ordinary at all. I called my boss and woke him up. He drove over, pale and furious, and after he calmed enough to be useful, he reported the incident to the police. They took the video from my phone. They said they'd send a patrol, and they put me in the system as a concerned citizen with a suspicious activity report. The patrol drove by a few times over the next nights. They recommended motion sensor lights and told me not to engage if I saw the person again. "Call 911, one officer said, steady and rehearsed. "Don't put yourself at risk." After that night, the boss installed cameras. He set them to record to the cloud and left the footage on a loop. He didn't want to be the kind of employer who left a dog-sitter in potential danger. The camera picked up nothing dramatic at first, just empty streetlights, cars that passed. Then one clip did show the silhouette under the streetlight, and in the footage you could see the charging motion as it crossed the frame. The video is grainy, but the motion is undeniable. We showed it to the police. They said it might be teenagers. They said it might be someone messing around. They also said it could be something more, and that was the part where their certainty ended and their caution began. To my boss's credit, he took it seriously. He changed routines. He showed up at odd hours to walk the property. He told me not to go out alone at night. He offered to pay for me to stay somewhere else. I declined. Pride, stubbornness, the sense that I'd already been violated enough. But I didn't sleep well. Every car that slowed on the street got my heart tightening. Every shadow in a window made me reach for the phone. Weeks passed. There were more sightings on cameras. Figures moving behind hedges at odd hours. Someone pacing under a lamp. People in the neighborhood whispered about teenagers and pranks, and the way the quiet stretches sometimes curve into risk. The police increased patrols for a while, then decreased. Cameras caught faces that didn't match any local IDs. Nothing became an arrest. The person who had charged at me and then said, "Have a good night," remained an unclosed file on someone's desk. These 3 moments, him in the tree line, the man in the basement, the person who charged and tried the door, don't stitch together into a single narrative. They don't make for one villain or a satisfying moral. What they do is form a pattern. Ordinary places as setting for extraordinary invasions. They taught me something ugly and practical. Closeness to normal circumstance does not equal safety. After the dog-sitting incident, I started to change small habits the way someone learns a new language. I took less spontaneous walks. I kept my phone on me. I stopped leaving the porch light off. My friends told me I was being sensible. Some told me I had become paranoid. I don't know where the line sits between those 2 states, and perhaps it shifts according to the nights you wake with your heart pretending to be a drum. There were helpers in each story. A couple on the trail, Ron and Tina's decision to call and to stand at the top of the stairwell, a boss who installed cameras and didn't brush off the footage. Everyday people who made ordinary choices that had extraordinary impacts. Their kindnesses didn't solve everything, but they changed outcomes. The couple's presence likely pushed the Purple Hat Man away. The fact that Ron and Tina called the police meant there was a record, and an officer came. The boss's cameras gave us proof to show the police and to sleep a little more easily. And then there are the limits. The police did what they could. They took statements, they patrolled, they told us to lock doors and to call if anything happened again. They were helpful within the framework they operate, staffed, stretched, bound by evidence and procedure. But proofs on phones don't always translate into arrests. Footage can identify someone, or it can be too grainy. A recorded figure in a tree line can easily be dismissed as a trick of light or misinterpretation. The man in the basement could be someone with nowhere else to go. He could be someone with intent. We don't know. The person at my boss's house could have been a bored local or something else entirely. Again, I don't know. That uncertainty is its own terror, the idea that a narrative can be true and still remain unresolved. I don't want to overstate the danger in a way that paralyzes people, nor do I want to reduce these events to a sensational list. They are instead a set of small tragedies of trust. We expect some corners of our lives to be safe and are occasionally proven wrong. What I can offer is what I learned in the aftermath, to respect the odd unease. When your chest tightens at a detail, listen to that tightening. It might make you seem foolish in the moment, but it's rarely wrong to be cautious. I also learned how powerful it is when strangers step into the gap. Help doesn't have to be dramatic. A couple walking a dog, a neighbor's flashlight, a boss who installs a camera. These are simple acts with outsized consequences. Sometimes people ask me if they should stop doing what they love, if hikers should avoid trails, if people should stop taking late-night walks, if owners should sell their houses. My answer is never to stop living. That would be surrender. Instead, live with a sharper awareness. Take precautions that make sense for you. Tell someone where you're going. Keep charged phones. Use cameras if you feel inclined. Report strange things. Document when you can. None of that guarantees safety. None of it ensures that any particular encounter will end well, but it puts proof into a system that can, in its best moments, respond. I keep thinking about the odd smallness of the things that proved real. The purple hat glimpsed half hidden behind a tree, a chipped Miami Dolphins mug on concrete next to a pillow, a silhouetted figure under a streetlight who offered a perfunctory, "Have a good night." Those are the artifacts of intrusion. They are ridiculous and domestic, and somehow the most convincing evidence that our private lives can be penetrated. A year after the trail incident, I still avoid that loop alone. Ron and Tina moved forward. Their house is quieter now, but with a cautious steadiness, the kind that comes from repairing trust in a place by ritual, checking the lock, ensuring the basement is sealed. The boss's cameras eventually recorded a person who matched no local ID. The police filed reports. None of those files, for me, is as tidy as the comfort of closure. I tell you these stories because they happened, because they are true, and because they taught me something about proximity. Danger isn't always dramatic. It doesn't always show up with obvious malice. Sometimes it's a figure under a streetlight, a hat in the background of a clip, a mug pressed into use in a corner no one knew to check. Those are the things that make you reevaluate how you move through the world. If there's a broader lesson here, it's modest and a little bitter. Be careful and be grateful. Be grateful for the people who intervene without thinking of themselves as heroes. Be careful about assuming safety in places that have always felt safe. Hold cameras as witnesses if you can. Report, record, and when fear comes, take it seriously enough to act. These nights changed me, not just in habits, though they did change my habits, but in my sense of how thin the veneer between ordinary and threatening can be. In each case, there was a mundane beginning, a hike, a new house, a dog-sitting gig. Each one spun into something that was not normal and not easily explained. Each one left me with an image I returned to at odd hours and a lesson in humility about how little we control. If you've stayed with me this long, you've heard 3 episodes that are, in their own ways, small testimonies to luck and to the thinness of our sense of security. You won't always have dramatic endings. Sometimes the person at the edge of your camera is gone by the time help arrives. Sometimes the evidence is a mug in a bag labeled for police. Sometimes all you have is a shaky video and the knowledge that none of it was imagined. If you have a real scary story, please share it in the comments or send it in. Sometimes the simple act of telling is useful. If these 3 stories moved you, hit like and subscribe. It helps me keep telling the kinds of true things that seem unbelievable until you hear them. Above all, take care of yourselves and look out for the small signs. Ordinary places can hide extraordinary threats, and ordinary people can make all the difference.